Sarah Martinez walked through the gates of Fort Braxton with the same quiet confidence she had carried through 20 years of classified missions. At 42, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of being invisible. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that gave no hint of her extraordinary background. To anyone watching, she looked like just another woman arriving for the joint military training exercise. The morning air was crisp as she made her way to the registration desk. Around her, hundreds of military personnel from different branches were checking in for what promised to be an intense 3-week program. The exercise, called Operation Iron Unity, was designed to test inter-service cooperation and push participants beyond their comfort zones. Sarah had been specifically requested for this training, though the invitation had come through unofficial channels. Behind the registration table sat a young Army corporal who looked barely old enough to shave. His name tag read Wilson, and his eyes widened slightly as he scanned the roster for Sarah's name. When he found it, he did a double take at the screen. "Ma'am, I'm showing you as a civilian contractor," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "But you're assigned to the advanced combat scenarios. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Sarah smiled, the kind of patient smile she reserved for people who didn't need to know more than necessary. "I'm in the right place, Corporal. The authorization should be there if you look a little deeper." Wilson clicked through several screens, his frown deepening with each page. Finally, he found what he was looking for, and his expression shifted to one of bewilderment mixed with respect. Whatever he had seen on that screen made him sit up straighter and speak more carefully. "Yes, ma'am. Everything appears to be in order. Your bunk assignment is in Building C, and your gear issue is at 1,400 hours. Welcome to Operation Iron Unity." As Sarah walked away from the desk, she could feel Wilson's curious gaze following her. She was used to that reaction. For the past 2 years, since officially retiring from the Navy, she had been working as a civilian contractor, specializing in close-quarters combat training and tactical assessment. Her official record was heavily redacted, showing only that she had served 20 years in various capacities. The details of her service with SEAL Team 6 remained classified at the highest levels. Building C was a stark, functional structure that housed female personnel. Sarah found her assigned room and was pleased to discover she would be sharing space with Captain Lisa Chen, an Air Force pilot, and Major Rebecca Torres, an Army intelligence officer. Both women were accomplished in their fields, and Sarah looked forward to working with competent professionals. Captain Chen was the first to introduce herself. She was in her early 30s, with short black hair and the kind of precise movements that came from years of flying high-performance aircraft. "I have to ask," Chen said as she helped Sarah unpack. "What's your background? The training roster lists you as a contractor, but you're assigned to scenarios that usually require special operations clearance." Sarah had prepared for this question. "I do consulting work on tactical training programs, mostly developing realistic scenarios based on field experience." Major Torres, who had been quietly organizing her own gear, looked up with interest. "What kind of field experience? If you don't mind me asking." 20 years Navy," Sarah replied simply. "Various assignments." It was a carefully crafted non-answer that satisfied curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. Both women seemed to accept it, though Sarah caught them exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The afternoon gear issue went smoothly. Sarah was handed standard military equipment, body armor, helmet, training weapons, and communication gear. She handled each piece with the automatic efficiency of someone who had used similar equipment thousands of times. The supply sergeant, a weathered Navy chief named Rodriguez, watched her with knowing eyes. "You handle that gear like you've worn it before," he commented as she adjusted the body armor with quick, practiced movements. "Some things you never forget," Sarah replied. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Indeed they don't. You let me know if anything doesn't fit right. We want everyone properly equipped for what's coming." That evening, the participants gathered in the main briefing hall for the opening ceremony. The room buzzed with nervous energy as nearly 300 military personnel found seats. Sarah chose a spot near the back, where she could observe without drawing attention. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors and the playing of the national anthem. As the final notes faded, a tall figure in Army dress uniform stepped to the podium. The room fell silent as General Patrick Morrison, a decorated veteran with over 30 years of service, surveyed the assembled crowd. Morrison was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet 4 inches with silver hair and the ramrod straight posture of a career soldier. His chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations, including the Silver Star and multiple Bronze Stars. He had commanded troops in 3 different conflicts and was known throughout the military for his no-nonsense approach to training and discipline. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room, "welcome to Operation Iron Unity. Over the next 3 weeks, you will be pushed beyond what you thought possible. You will work with personnel from other services, learn new tactics, and discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed." Sarah listened with professional interest as Morrison outlined the training schedule. The program was ambitious, covering everything from joint urban operations to wilderness survival. Each phase would test different aspects of military proficiency and inter-service cooperation. "This training is not about individual achievement," Morrison continued. "It's about learning to function as part of something larger than yourself. Some of you are accustomed to being the expert in your field. Here, you will be students again." As Morrison spoke, Sarah found herself studying his body language and presentation style. It was an automatic assessment, the kind of unconscious evaluation she had performed countless times during briefings with foreign military leaders, government officials, and other high-value targets. Morrison carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged, someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. The general's eyes swept across the audience as he concluded his remarks. "Tomorrow, we begin with basic combat assessments. Every participant will be evaluated on hand-to-hand combat proficiency, marksmanship, and tactical thinking. These assessments will determine your training groups for the remainder of the exercise." After the ceremony, participants milled around the hall, introducing themselves and forming informal groups. Sarah noticed the natural segregation that occurred, with personnel gravitating toward others from their own service branch. Air Force pilots clustered together near the front, while Army officers gathered along the right side of the room. She was making her way toward the exit when she overheard a conversation that made her pause. General Morrison was speaking with a group of senior officers, his voice carrying more than he probably intended. "The civilian contractor assignments are political nonsense," Morrison was saying. "This is a military training exercise, not a place for consultants to play soldier. We'll see how long they last when the real work begins." Colonel James Patterson, the exercise coordinator, nodded in agreement. "Some of these civilian slots are mandated from Washington. We have to include them, but we don't have to go easy on them." Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced before every dangerous mission. It wasn't anger, exactly, but rather a cold determination that had served her well in places where failure meant death. She had spent her career proving herself in environments where being underestimated was often an advantage. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah reflected on the challenge ahead. She had faced Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, pursued high-value targets through the mountains of Pakistan, and conducted rescue operations in hostile territory across 3 continents. She had operated in conditions that would break most people, and she had done it while carrying the additional burden of proving that a woman belonged in the most elite units of the military. Now, in what should have been a routine training exercise, she found herself facing a different kind of challenge. General Morrison and his staff clearly viewed her as an unwelcome intruder, someone who would need to be carried by more qualified personnel. They had no idea that they were looking at one of the most decorated members of SEAL Team 6, a woman who had participated in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Back in her room, Sarah began her evening routine of equipment maintenance and mental preparation. Captain Chen and Major Torres were engaged in their own preparations, discussing the upcoming assessments with the kind of nervous energy common among high achievers facing unknown challenges. "What do you think the hand-to-hand combat assessment will involve?" Chen asked, checking the fit of her protective gear. Torres, who had martial arts training, offered her opinion. "Probably basic self-defense techniques and maybe some controlled sparring. They'll want to see how we handle ourselves without seriously injuring anyone." Sarah listened to their speculation while methodically checking her equipment. In her experience, the most telling assessments were often the ones that seemed routine on the surface: the way someone moved, the decisions they made under pressure, and their ability to adapt to unexpected situations revealed far more than any written test. She thought about the conversation she had overheard after the ceremony. General Morrison's dismissive attitude toward civilian contractors was not uncommon in the military. Many career officers viewed outside expertise with suspicion, particularly when it came to combat training. They saw the military as an exclusive club where only those who had earned their place through traditional channels deserved respect. What Morrison didn't understand was that Sarah's path to expertise had been anything but traditional. As one of the first women to complete SEAL training, she had faced challenges that went far beyond the already extreme physical and mental demands of the program. She had been forced to prove herself over and over again, in training and in combat, to earn acceptance from teammates who initially saw her as a liability. The irony was not lost on her. After 20 years of conducting some of the most dangerous and sensitive operations in military history, she was once again being judged based on assumptions and appearances. The general and his staff looked at her and saw a civilian contractor who might be able to contribute to theoretical discussions, but would likely struggle with the physical demands of real training. They were about to discover how wrong they were. As she settled into her bunk for the night, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow's assessments would be interesting, and she had a feeling that General Morrison was going to learn something about the danger of underestimating people based on incomplete information. The last thing she remembered before falling asleep was the sound of helicopters in the distance, their rotors beating a familiar rhythm that carried her back to countless nights in forward operating bases around the world. Some things, she reflected, never really left you. They became part of who you were, invisible to those who didn't know how to look, but always ready to emerge when the situation demanded it. Tomorrow, she would begin to show them exactly what 20 years as a Navy SEAL had taught her. And she suspected that General Morrison, for all his experience and decorations, was about to receive an education in what real capability looked like. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training compound as participants gathered for the combat assessments. Sarah arrived early, having completed her usual pre-dawn workout routine in the base gymnasium. She had noticed several other participants doing the same, and it was clear that everyone understood the importance of making a strong first impression. The assessment area had been set up with multiple stations, each designed to test different aspects of combat proficiency. Marksmanship ranges occupied one side of the compound, while hand-to-hand combat mats were arranged in the center. Obstacle courses and tactical scenario areas rounded out the testing environment. General Morrison stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, observing as his staff organized the participants into groups. Sarah noticed that he paid particular attention to the civilian contractors, watching them with the expression of someone expecting to be disappointed. Colonel Patterson called the group to attention and began explaining the assessment procedures. Each of you will rotate through all stations over the course of the day. Your performance will be carefully evaluated and will determine your placement in training groups. We expect military bearing and maximum effort from everyone. As the groups were announced, Sarah found herself assigned to Group 7, along with a mix of personnel from different services. She was pleased to see that Captain Chen and Major Torres were in the same group, though she noticed that most of the other civilian contractors had been placed together in what appeared to be a separate category. The first station was marksmanship, and Sarah approached it with quiet confidence. She had always been an exceptional shooter, but her SEAL training had elevated her skills to an elite level. As she stepped up to the firing line, she was handed a standard M4 carbine and given basic instructions by the range officer. "You'll have 30 rounds to engage targets at various distances," the sergeant explained. "Take your time, focus on accuracy, and call your shots." Sarah nodded and assumed a comfortable firing position. The familiar weight of the weapon in her hands brought back a flood of memories from training ranges around the world. She had fired these same weapons in combat situations where a single missed shot could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The targets ranged from 50 to 300 meters, with varying sizes and exposure times. Sarah began firing with smooth, controlled movements, each shot placed with surgical precision. Around her, other participants were struggling with the wind conditions and the pressure of being evaluated, but Sarah felt completely at ease. When she finished the course of fire, the range officer examined her target through binoculars and let out a low whistle. "Ma'am, that's some of the finest shooting I've seen in 20 years of running this range. Every round is inside the X-ring." Word of Sarah's marksmanship performance spread quickly through the training group. By the time they moved to the next station, she had attracted the attention of several instructors and participants. General Morrison, who had been observing from a distance, made a note on his clipboard and continued watching with increased interest. The tactical scenarios proved equally easy for Sarah. She moved through urban combat simulations with the fluid efficiency of someone who had actually cleared hostile buildings under fire. Her decision-making was quick and sound, and she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of squad-level tactics that impressed even the veteran instructors. During one particularly complex scenario involving a hostage rescue, Sarah took charge of her assigned team without being asked. She assessed the situation, assigned roles based on each team member's capabilities, and led them through a flawless execution that freed the hostages while neutralizing all threats. Master Sergeant Brooks, the scenario instructor, pulled Colonel Patterson aside as Sarah's team completed their run. "Sir, I don't know what this woman's background is, but she just ran that scenario better than most special operations personnel I've worked with. Her tactical awareness is off the charts." Patterson frowned as he watched Sarah helping her teammates analyze their performance. "She's listed as a civilian contractor. Some kind of training consultant. Sir, with respect, consultants don't move like that. She's been in the field, and recently, I'd stake my reputation on it." As the day progressed, Sarah's exceptional performance became impossible to ignore. At each station, she demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded what anyone expected from a civilian contractor. She completed the obstacle course in a time that would have been respectable for an elite infantry soldier. Her hand-to-hand combat techniques were precise and effective, clearly the result of extensive training and real-world application. By late afternoon, the participants had completed all stations except for the final assessment, individual combat demonstrations with senior instructors. This was designed as a culminating exercise where each participant would face a skilled opponent in controlled combat to demonstrate their overall proficiency. General Morrison had decided to personally oversee this portion of the assessment. He stood in the center of the main combat mat, having removed his outer uniform to reveal the lean, muscular build of a man who had maintained his physical conditioning throughout his career. At 55, he was still formidable, with the kind of practical fighting skills that came from decades of military service and personal combat training. "This final assessment," Morrison announced to the gathered participants, "will test your ability to apply everything you've learned under pressure. Each of you will face an instructor in a controlled combat scenario. We're looking for tactical thinking, adaptation, and the warrior spirit that defines military excellence." Sarah watched as participants took turns on the mat. Morrison was an experienced fighter, and it was clear that he enjoyed demonstrating his superiority over younger personnel. He was skilled, aggressive, and used his size and experience to dominate most of his opponents. Several participants left the mat visibly shaken, having been decisively outmatched by the general's capabilities. When Sarah's name was called, a ripple of interest went through the crowd. Many participants had heard about her performance throughout the day, and there was genuine curiosity about how she would fare against Morrison. The general himself seemed particularly interested, having watched her previous demonstrations with growing skepticism. As Sarah stepped onto the mat, Morrison sized her up with the calculating gaze of an experienced fighter. She was smaller than most of his previous opponents, standing 5 feet 6 inches and weighing perhaps 130 pounds. To most observers, the matchup appeared grossly unfair. "Well, Miss Martinez," Morrison said, his voice carrying a hint of condescension, "let's see if your consulting expertise extends to personal combat. I'll try not to be too rough." Sarah said nothing, simply nodding and assuming a relaxed fighting stance. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and she was content to let her performance make whatever point needed to be made. The rules were simple: controlled combat with protective gear, victory achieved through submission, decisive strikes to vital areas, or referee intervention. Morrison approached with the confidence of a man who had never lost one of these demonstrations, his movements those of a skilled boxer and wrestler. The general opened with a probing jab, testing Sarah's reflexes and defensive capabilities. She slipped the punch easily, her movement so subtle that it appeared effortless. Morrison followed with a combination of strikes, putting more force behind his attacks as he sought to establish dominance. What happened next surprised everyone watching, including Morrison himself. Sarah didn't just defend against his attacks. She began to systematically dismantle his offensive strategy. Every punch he threw was countered or avoided, and she began to score with precise strikes that found their way through his defenses despite his size and reach advantages. Morrison's confidence began to waver as he realized that none of his usual tactics were working. Sarah moved like water around his attacks, always in position to counter, never where he expected her to be. Her strikes, while not as powerful as his, were placed with surgical accuracy that demonstrated a deep understanding of human anatomy and combat effectiveness. The crowd of observers had grown silent, watching in amazement as the petite contractor systematically outfought one of the army's most respected generals. Morrison, growing frustrated and perhaps embarrassed, decided to end the demonstration decisively. He feinted with a jab and then launched a powerful right cross that would have ended the fight against most opponents. Sarah saw the attack coming from the moment Morrison shifted his weight. She ducked under the punch, stepped inside his guard, and executed a perfect takedown that sent the general crashing to the mat. Before he could react, she had secured a submission hold that left him completely helpless. Her arm locked around his throat in a blood choke that would render him unconscious in seconds if he didn't tap out. For a moment, Morrison struggled against the hold, his pride preventing him from admitting defeat. But Sarah's technique was flawless, and he quickly realized that further resistance would only result in humiliation when he inevitably lost consciousness. He tapped out, and Sarah immediately released the hold, helping him to his feet with the same quiet professionalism she had shown throughout the exercise. The training area erupted in shocked murmurs and whispers. In 30 years of military service, no one had ever seen General Morrison defeated in personal combat. The man himself stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened while catching his breath. Colonel Patterson approached the mat with wide eyes, unsure of how to handle the unprecedented situation. The exercise was supposed to demonstrate military superiority over civilian contractors, not the reverse. Several senior officers gathered around Morrison, equally shocked by what they had witnessed. "That was exceptional technique," Morrison said finally, his voice hoarse from the submission hold. His pride was wounded, but his professional respect for superior skill overrode his embarrassment. "Where exactly did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah looked at him calmly, her expression giving nothing away. "Various places, General. 20 years provides a lot of learning opportunities." 20 years of what, exactly? Morrison pressed, his earlier dismissive attitude replaced by genuine curiosity and growing suspicion. 20 years of serving my country in whatever capacity was required." The general studied her more carefully now, noting details he had missed during his initial assessment. The way she carried herself, her automatic awareness of everything happening around them, and the casual competence with which she had dismantled his own considerable fighting skills. These were not the characteristics of a typical military contractor. "Colonel Patterson," Morrison called, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "I want to see this woman's complete file. Everything we have on her background and clearances." Patterson nodded and hurried away. But Sarah knew that the standard file would reveal nothing useful. Her real service record was classified at levels that required special authorization to access, and even then, most of the significant details were heavily redacted. As the crowd began to disperse and other participants continued their assessments, Morrison approached Sarah with a different attitude entirely. Gone was the condescending tone and dismissive posture. He was now speaking to her as one professional warrior to another. "Miss Martinez, I've been in the military for over 30 years, and I've worked with some of the finest fighters in the world. What you just demonstrated goes far beyond anything I would expect from a civilian contractor or even most active duty personnel. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your background." Sarah considered her options carefully. Her cover story had served its purpose up to this point, but Morrison was clearly too experienced and too smart to be satisfied with vague explanations. Moreover, his earlier comments about civilian contractors had stung more than she cared to admit, and part of her wanted him to understand exactly whom he had been dismissing. "General," she said quietly, "there are things about my service record that I'm not at liberty to discuss, but I can tell you that I've spent the last 20 years in situations where failure wasn't an option and where being underestimated was often a tactical advantage." Morrison's eyes narrowed as pieces of a puzzle began to fall into place. "What was your rate in the Navy?" "That's classified." "Your unit assignments?" "Also classified." "Your deployment history?" "Still classified." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, understanding dawning in his expression. There were very few Navy positions that would result in such extensive classification of service records, and even fewer that would produce the kind of combat skills Sarah had just demonstrated. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, as the full implications of what he was thinking hit him. "You're a SEAL." Sarah's expression didn't change, But she didn't deny the statement either. Morrison took her silence as confirmation and felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the magnitude of his earlier misjudgment. He had been dismissing and planning to humiliate one of the most elite warriors in the American military. Worse, he had done it in front of hundreds of personnel who would soon be spreading the story throughout their respective services. The woman he had condescendingly offered to go easy on had just demonstrated that she could probably defeat anyone on the base in personal combat. "How long?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 20 years of active service," Sarah replied simply. "Various assignments, various locations." Morrison closed his eyes briefly, feeling the full weight of his mistake. 20 years as a Navy SEAL meant that Sarah had likely participated in some of the most sensitive and dangerous operations in recent military history. She had probably been in more actual combat than most of the personnel at the training exercise, including himself. When Colonel Patterson returned with Sarah's file, Morrison reviewed it quickly and found exactly what he expected. Page after page of redacted information that revealed nothing of substance about her real service. The few details that remained painted the picture of a decorated veteran with an exemplary record, but gave no hint of the true nature of her assignments. "This file is practically worthless," Morrison told Patterson. "Everything significant has been classified out." "Sir, what do you want me to do with this information?" Morrison looked across the training area, where Sarah was helping other participants analyze their performance with the same quiet professionalism she had shown throughout the day. He realized that he was facing a choice that would define the rest of the training exercise and potentially his own reputation. He could treat the afternoon's events as an anomaly and attempt to minimize their significance, or he could acknowledge that he had seriously underestimated one of his participants and adjust his approach accordingly. For a man who had built his career on recognizing and developing military talent, there was really only one acceptable choice. "Colonel," Morrison said finally, "I want Miss Martinez reassigned to the advanced training track immediately. Whatever her actual background, she's operating at a level that requires different challenges." As the sun began to set over the training compound, Morrison found himself reflecting on the day's events. In his long career, he had prided himself on being able to assess personnel accurately and quickly. Today, he had been completely wrong about someone whose capabilities far exceeded his own. The lesson was both humbling and enlightening. It reminded him that in the military, as in combat, assumptions could be deadly, and that true capability didn't always come in the packages you expected. Word of the afternoon's events spread through the base like wildfire. By evening chow, every participant in Operation Iron Unity had heard some version of the story about the civilian contractor who had defeated General Morrison in hand-to-hand combat. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent. A quiet woman from the contractor group had systematically dismantled one of the Army's most respected combat leaders. Sarah found herself at the center of unwanted attention as she moved through the dining facility. Conversations stopped when she passed, and she could feel hundreds of eyes following her movements. She had experienced similar scrutiny before, during her early years as one of the first women in SEAL training, but it never became comfortable. Captain Chen and Major Torres had saved her a seat at their usual table, and both women were practically vibrating with curiosity as she sat down with her meal. "Okay, we need to talk," Chen said without preamble. "What happened out there this afternoon is impossible unless you're someone completely different from what you've told us." Sarah took a bite of her dinner and considered how to respond. The events of the day had effectively blown her cover, at least with the senior leadership, and she suspected that maintaining the fiction of being a simple contractor would become increasingly difficult. "I told you I had field experience," she said finally. 20 years in various Navy assignments." Major Torres leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Sarah, I've been in the Army for 12 years, and I've worked with special operations personnel. The way you moved today, the techniques you used, that's not standard Navy training. That's something much more specialized." Before Sarah could respond, they were approached by Master Sergeant Brooks, the scenario instructor who had been so impressed with her tactical performance earlier in the day. His expression was respectful but determined. "Ma'am, General Morrison would like to see you in his office when you've finished your meal. He asked me to tell you that this is not disciplinary, just a conversation between professionals." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by the request. She had expected this meeting since the moment Morrison began asking pointed questions about her background. "Tell the General, I'll be there in 20 minutes." After Brooks left, Chen and Torres stared at her with open amazement. "He's calling you to his office for a professional conversation," Torres said slowly. "After you just beat him in combat in front of half the base. Who are you, really?" Sarah finished her meal in thoughtful silence, then looked at her two roommates with the expression of someone making a difficult decision. "I can't give you details, but I can tell you that I spent 20 years in positions where being underestimated was often a survival advantage. Today, that advantage was worth giving up to make a point." She stood to leave, and Chen reached out to touch her arm. "Sarah, whatever your real background is, thank you. Watching you out there today reminded me why I joined the military in the first place. It's been a long time since I've seen someone demonstrate that kind of excellence." 20 minutes later, Sarah knocked on the door of General Morrison's temporary office. When she entered, she found Morrison alone, having dismissed his usual staff for the conversation. He was seated behind a simple field desk, and his entire demeanor had changed since their encounter on the training mat. "Please, have a seat," Morrison said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I want to start by offering you an apology. My comments about civilian contractors were unprofessional and unworthy of someone in my position. They were also, as you demonstrated quite effectively, completely wrong." Sarah sat down, maintaining the same calm composure she had shown throughout the day. "General, you were working with the information you had. Assumptions are natural when dealing with incomplete data." Morrison studied her carefully. "Miss Martinez, I've made some inquiries since this afternoon. I can't access the classified portions of your record, but I've spoken with people who can. What they've told me has given me a very different perspective on today's events." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I understand that your actual service record involves assignments that few people in the military will ever be cleared to know about. I also understand that your transition to civilian contractor status was recent, and that your presence here is part of an assessment program I wasn't fully briefed on." Sarah remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his statements. Her expression gave nothing away, but Morrison was experienced enough to read between the lines. "What I want to know," Morrison continued, "is what you think about the training program so far. From your unique perspective, how could we improve what we're doing here?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected interrogation about her background or demands for full disclosure. Instead, Morrison was asking for her professional opinion as a military expert. "Sir, may I speak freely?" "Please do. I'm more interested in honest assessment than diplomatic courtesy." Sarah leaned back in her chair, organizing her thoughts. "The basic structure of the program is sound, but there are some fundamental issues with how you're evaluating personnel. You're testing skills that matter, but you're not creating conditions that reveal how people perform under genuine stress." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Today's assessments were challenging, but they were still essentially academic exercises. Everyone knew they were being tested, they understood the parameters, and they had time to prepare mentally. Real operations don't work that way. Sometimes you have to perform with no preparation, incomplete information, and consequences that go far beyond personal embarrassment." "What would you suggest?" Sarah thought about some of the most revealing training scenarios she had experienced during her SEAL career. Introduce genuine unpredictability. Wake people up at 3 in the morning and give them an immediate tactical problem to solve with whatever equipment they can grab in 5 minutes. Create scenarios where the mission parameters change halfway through execution. Test their ability to make life or death decisions with insufficient data. Morrison nodded slowly. "That's assuming we want to identify people capable of special operations work. Most of these participants will never face that level of challenge. With respect, sir, that's not necessarily true anymore. The nature of modern conflict means that conventional forces are increasingly being asked to operate in unconventional situations. The skills that used to be limited to special operations are becoming necessary for a much broader range of personnel." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Morrison asking detailed questions about training methodologies, assessment techniques, and personnel development. Sarah found herself drawing on 2 decades of experience in the most demanding military environments, offering insights that could only come from someone who had operated at the highest levels of special operations. As their discussion wound down, Morrison made a decision that would reshape the remainder of Operation Iron Unity. "Miss Martinez, I want to offer you a position as senior training advisor for the rest of this exercise. You would work directly with my staff to redesign some of our scenarios and assessment criteria. Your insights could make this program significantly more valuable for everyone involved. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Accepting would mean revealing more about her capabilities and background than she had planned, but it would also provide an opportunity to influence training that could affect hundreds of military personnel over the years to come. I accept with the understanding that certain aspects of my background remain classified. Understood completely. Over the following days, the atmosphere at Operation Iron Unity underwent a dramatic transformation. Sarah's involvement in redesigning the training scenarios brought a level of realism and challenge that participants had never experienced before. Working closely with Morrison and his staff, she created exercises that tested not just technical skills but adaptability, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to function effectively when plans fell apart. The participants initially struggled with the increased difficulty, but they quickly began to rise to the challenge. Sarah worked individually with personnel who showed potential, sharing techniques and insights that could only come from someone who had applied these skills in actual combat. Captain Chen proved to be particularly receptive to advanced tactical training, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of complex scenarios that impressed even Sarah. Major Torres excelled in intelligence analysis under pressure, developing capabilities that would serve her well in future assignments. But perhaps the most significant change was in General Morrison himself. The humbling experience of being outmatched by someone he had initially dismissed had forced him to reconsider many of his assumptions about capability and potential. He began to approach personnel evaluation with more nuance, looking beyond surface appearances to identify hidden strengths and capabilities. One evening, as Sarah was reviewing the day's training results in the operations center, Morrison joined her at the planning table. "I've been thinking about what happened that first day," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "I spent 30 years believing I was a good judge of people, and you showed me how wrong I could be. That's not an easy lesson for someone in my position." Sarah looked up from the reports she was reviewing. "Sir, evaluation is always difficult when you're working with incomplete information. The classified nature of some military specialties makes it almost impossible to assess people accurately based on standard records. How many others like you are out there?" Morrison asked. "People whose real capabilities are hidden behind classification and bureaucracy. More than you might think, sir. The military has always had personnel whose contributions can't be fully recognized or documented. They do the work that needs to be done, and then return to normal assignments without fanfare." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "This experience has taught me to be more careful about my assumptions. I can't help but wonder how many other exceptional people I've overlooked over the years because they didn't fit my expectations." As Operation Iron Unity entered its final week, the transformation was evident to everyone involved. Participants were performing at levels they hadn't thought possible, and the quality of inter-service cooperation had reached unprecedented heights. The scenarios designed by Sarah challenged personnel to think beyond their traditional roles and develop capabilities that would serve them throughout their careers. The final exercise was a complex multi-day operation that tested everything the participants had learned. Teams of mixed personnel from different services were given challenging missions that required them to operate in unfamiliar environments with minimal support. Sarah observed from the operations center, monitoring radio communications and tracking progress through various checkpoints. General Morrison stood beside her, watching with obvious pride as participants tackled challenges that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. "They're performing better than I ever expected," he said. "Your influence on this program has been extraordinary. They always had the potential, sir. They just needed the right kind of challenges to bring it out." As the exercise concluded and participants began their final evaluations, Sarah reflected on her own journey over the past 3 weeks. She had come to Operation Iron Unity as a way to ease into civilian life while still contributing to military training. Instead, she had found herself confronting assumptions about capability, identity, and the nature of military excellence. The final ceremony was held in the same hall where Morrison had delivered his opening remarks 3 weeks earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Participants who had arrived as strangers from different services had formed bonds that would last throughout their careers. They had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed and had learned to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating others. When Morrison took the podium for his closing remarks, he spoke with a humility and wisdom that hadn't been present in his opening speech. 3 weeks ago, I told you that this training would push you beyond what you thought possible. What I didn't anticipate was how much it would teach me as well. I learned that excellence comes in many forms, that assumptions can be dangerous, and that the most capable people are not always the ones you'd expect. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. I also learned that true warriors earn respect through their actions, not their uniforms or their official titles. Some of the finest military professionals I've ever worked with don't fit traditional molds, and recognizing their contributions requires us to look beyond our preconceptions. As the ceremony concluded and participants began to disperse, many approached Sarah to express their gratitude for the training and insights she had provided. Word of her real background had spread quietly through the group, not through official channels but through the informal networks that always develop among military personnel. Captain Chen was among the last to approach her. Sarah, I know I'll probably never know the full story of your service, but I want you to know that meeting you has changed how I think about my own potential. Watching you over these past weeks has reminded me that we're all capable of more than we usually demand of ourselves. Major Torres nodded in agreement. The techniques you've taught us aren't just about combat or training. They're about approaching challenges with confidence and not letting other people's limitations define what we think we can accomplish. As Sarah packed her gear for departure, she thought about the unexpected turns her life had taken since leaving active duty. She had expected civilian contracting work to be a quiet transition, a way to use her skills without the intensity and danger of her previous assignments. Instead, she had found herself at the center of a training revolution that would influence military personnel for years to come. General Morrison made a point of speaking with her privately before her departure. Miss Martinez, I want you to know that this experience has been transformational for me personally and professionally. I've submitted a report recommending that your methodologies be incorporated into training programs throughout the military. Your influence will extend far beyond Operation Iron Unity. He paused, then added, I also want to apologize again for my initial attitude. I've learned that the most dangerous assumption a leader can make is that they know everything about the people they're working with. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Morrison had seen from her during their entire time together. General, the best leaders are the ones who can learn from their mistakes and adjust their approach accordingly. That willingness to change when presented with new information is exactly what makes you effective. As she drove away from Fort Braxton, Sarah reflected on the lessons of the past 3 weeks. She had been forced to reveal more about herself than she had planned, but in doing so, she had contributed to something meaningful. The personnel who had participated in Operation Iron Unity would carry those lessons throughout their careers, and some of them would undoubtedly face situations where those lessons could mean the difference between success and failure. More importantly, she had helped demonstrate that capability and excellence came in many forms, and that the military's strength lay not just in its traditional warriors but in its ability to recognize and develop talent wherever it existed. The woman who had walked onto the base as an anonymous contractor was leaving as someone who had influenced military training doctrine and challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership and potential. Behind her, Fort Braxton continued its mission of preparing America's military personnel for the challenges they would face in service to their country. But now, thanks to the unexpected lessons learned during Operation Iron Unity, that preparation included a deeper understanding of what was truly possible when talent was recognized and nurtured, regardless of the package it came in. General Morrison stood at his office window, watching Sarah's vehicle disappear into the distance. In his long career, he had worked with many exceptional people, but few had challenged him to grow in the way she had. The lessons he had learned would stay with him for the remainder of his service, making him a better leader and a more thoughtful judge of human potential. 3 weeks earlier, he had been confident in his ability to assess people quickly and accurately. Now he understood that the most valuable insights often came from those who didn't fit conventional expectations, and that true wisdom lay in remaining open to being surprised by the capabilities of others.